And one of the great privileges that we have at the Centre is welcoming a variety of visitors from around the world, and tonight is one of those terrific occasions when we are absolutely delighted to welcome Professor David FitzGerald, who's joining us from the US, and he's going to speak to us about what he has termed remote control of asylum seekers, the US experience. David is the Theodore E. Gildred Chair in US-Mexican Relations, as well as Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. He is co-author of a book called Culling the Masses, The Democratic Roots of Racist Immigration Policy in the Americas, which was published a few years ago by Harvard University Press. And he also wrote A Nation of Immigrants, How Mexico Manages Its Migration, which was published in 2009. He's co-editor of 6 books on Mexico-US migration, and I'm sure his knowledge and expertise are in particularly high demand at the moment. He's worked on the politics of international migration, citizenship, and research methodologies, and he's been published in a wide array of top peer-reviewed international journals. In 2013, he won the American Sociological Association's International Migration Section Award for Public Sociology. And as the topic of tonight's presentation might suggest, his current project is examining asylum policies in a comparative perspective, but tonight he's going to focus for us on the US experience. We are, for those who are using Twitter, using the hashtag, which is up here but is rather small, hashtag US Asylum for anybody who wants to tweet throughout the lecture. David will speak for about half an hour and then we'll take questions from the floor. And I'll just let you know that we are recording the session, so if in asking a question you don't want that to be recorded, please just signal it and we'll ensure that either it's not recorded or it's cut out of any recording that we might want to make public later on. So I'd now like to welcome David to the floor. David, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to Jane and Claire for inviting me, and to the Kaldor Centre. It's a real pleasure to be with you here and talk about my current research and also to learn more about the Australian experience at the same time. So I'll try to wrap up my remarks fairly quickly so we'll have lots of time for discussion. As I'm sure you know, there's sorry, let me just bring up my presentation here. There's been a lot of talk, maybe too much talk, about building a big beautiful wall on the US-Mexico border. And the way that's discussed almost has the assumption that it's an open border now, which is very curious as someone who lives in San Diego on the border with Mexico at the world's busiest border crossing. There's already quite a bit of a border fortification. You can actually see it from 35,000 feet as you fly along the Texas-Mexico border and into California. Since the mid-1990s, the US has spent a lot of money, put a lot of agents, the order of about 20,000 agents on the border between Mexico and the US. And for about a third of the existing border right now, there's some kind of border fortification. And the style of fortification varies from place to place, but in San Diego, this is what it looks like. So at the same time as we're talking about creating a new wall, there's already quite a bit of a wall. The other curious thing about this discussion is that if you look at the number of apprehensions every year since the 1960s, you can see that today the US is at an historic low. This is the lowest level of apprehensions of people coming across the southwest border without papers in my lifetime. Something else that's not widely remarked on, in the mainstream media at least, is that about half of the people who are being apprehended now on that border are other than Mexican. And historically, that's been an overwhelmingly Mexican flow. So most of the media attention, though, has been on building some kind of Great Wall and flows from Mexico to the US. But I want to talk about some other processes that happened in the darkness, behind the scenes, and various ways that the US government is trying to prevent irregular migrants and often asylum seekers in particular, or in ways that especially affect asylum seekers, from ever even reaching this border wall or ever even reaching a US airport. And I'll begin with the idea of a dome, a giant dome over North America. There have been a number of different techniques that have been developed to keep people from ever reaching North America. These technologies are also being used in places like Australia and Europe, but the academic research on this, and particularly that coming out of Europe, often acts as if this is a relatively new set of ideas coming out of the 1990s, when in fact there's much deeper historical precedent in the US case for these kinds of activities. So there have been forms of pre-clearance where passengers interact with US agents on foreign soil, going back to the late 19th century for Europeans transiting Canada to get to the US. The same for air passengers in the Toronto airport since 1952 and in a number of other countries around the world. The US has had carrier sanctions against ship masters bringing unauthorized or inadmissible immigrants, going also back to the 19th century, various forms of carrier sanctions on air arrivals since 1952. And visa policy. It might seem natural today that you have to have a visa to travel, but it is fairly recent in history. Originally, visas were introduced during World War I as an emergency measure, but as is often the case, something that happens at a moment of crisis then becomes sticky and institutionalized. And by 1924 in the US, as in many other countries, visas became required. It's worth noting that these requirements were first thought to be outrageous by travelers, to be treated like common criminals, to have fingerprints taken, to be photographed, and now people do it all the time and they don't even think twice about it. It's become normalized. There's also a lot of coordination with neighbors that happens behind the scenes. Some of the coordination with Canada is fairly well known. Very little is publicly known about the coordination that happens behind the scenes with the government of Mexico. So all air passengers arriving in Canada or the US or Mexico, even if they're not intending to travel to the US, they have their information shared in advance with US security agencies. Behind the scenes, the US government has quite effectively pressured the Mexican government to make it very difficult for nationals of 40 countries to get visas to come to the US. Those nationalities tend to be concentrated in the Middle East, Asia, Colombia. Again, not everyone is an asylum seeker, but it's something that disproportionately makes it quite difficult for asylum seekers to ever reach Mexico, should they then intend to go to the US. There are very few limitations, very few sort of institutional constraints on the dome. And part of my broader project is to figure out not only what are the different techniques being used in the US, Europe, and Australia, but also what are some of the constraints, even if they're partial constraints on those techniques. And of all the different styles of externalization of borders that I'm going to be referring to this evening, it's the dome, that has the fewest constraints. That's because these visa restrictions, as I said, have become taken for granted. You don't see people really complaining about these. Air travel has been so resolutely securitized, it's hard to imagine that being walked back. And then there's also been quite a successful demonization of anything having to do with paying people smugglers for the service of moving without papers from one country to another. There's often a deliberate conflation of trafficking, which involves coercion, and smuggling, which doesn't inherently involve coercion. So for these reasons, I think we're unlikely to see many restraints on this going forward either. Let me turn now to the idea of a moat around North America as well. Here in this image, which comes from a multi-agency U.S. task force planning for mass movements from the Caribbean to Florida, you can see Sam the Eagle cruising down here from Florida. This is Cuba here, and the Dominican Republic and Haiti on the right. The U.S. has been involved in maritime interdictions in a serious way since the early 1980s. There were two major waves in the early 1990s. They've primarily affected Haitians in light blue and Cubans in yellow. but there have also been important interdictions of, for example, Chinese within the Caribbean and lesser known instances in the Western Pacific around Guam. Now, when the Reagan administration created the executive order to authorize these kinds of interdictions on the high seas, they very explicitly said that the principle of non-refoulement would apply, the principle that people would not be returned to a country where they would face persecution on these specific UN grounds. But during the crisis in 1992, the administration of Bush Sr. Very explicitly said that the non-refoulement provisions would no longer be observed on the high seas. When Bill Clinton was running for president, he said that this was an outrage, and once he took office, he continued the same policy. Once again, it became sticky. This decision went all the way to the US Supreme Court, which upheld it. A lot of people in this room have written very prominently that this is bad law. Nevertheless, this is the law in the US currently that says that both the US domestic law and the Refugee Convention don't apply to interdictions on the high seas. But there's some interesting exceptions, which I think are worth exploring, even if they're problematic. I think as a sociologist, I'm interested in exploring why we sometimes see the executive conducting forms of screening, even if we might think from a normative position that they are inadequate. So one of those is what has been termed by some as the shout test, and this applies to all nationalities save two, and I'll get into the other two in a moment. So the idea here is that on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter with a large number of people perhaps, if someone were to jump up and down and say, I am asking for asylum based on persecution if I go home because of my political beliefs, then there will be some kind of screening. But there's no other kind of screening of people in any kind of systematic or individual way. So it's certainly a very thin form of screening. It's interesting that it exists at all, given that the Supreme Court has given the executive complete latitude to do what it likes on the high seas. For Chinese nationals, there is a written form that's administered only for Chinese. This is not particularly relevant at this moment, but in the past, and particularly in the 1990s, this is something that affected several thousand people who were interdicted. And then, importantly, until January of this year, there was a very big exception for Cuban nationals. And I want to talk for a minute about the way that Cubans have been treated. There's a lot of misinformation, even among academics in the US who study migration. You may have heard of the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy, and you would look in vain in US law for something called the wet foot, dry foot policy. There's no single such thing. It's a combination of a couple of different kinds of law and some administrative interpretations. So the wet foot part of this policy goes back to a bilateral agreement between the US and Cuban governments, where for the first time the Cuban government agreed to take back Cubans who were interdicted by the United States. Before 1994, it was extremely rare for the Cuban government to accept that. Importantly, this applied to both Cubans interdicted in international waters as well as US waters, but there has always been some form of shipboard screening, where if someone, up until January, if someone were to pass an initial credible fear interview, they would then be taken to Guantanamo, to the US Naval Station for more extensive screening, and if they were to eventually pass all of those tests, or whether or not that they were refugees, then they would be resettled in some third country. So the dry foot aspect of this policy is that until, wet foot is still in effect. So the dry foot aspect is that until January, based on the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, that someone who made it to dry US soil would be, in almost all cases, paroled into the US. This is an idiosyncratic use of parole that has nothing to do with the normal criminal context. It means that the government, the US government, the Attorney General, brings someone in outside of the normal kinds of avenues. And this has been done with many hundreds of thousands of people, not just Cubans, but the Cubans have the nationality to most benefit from this. Okay, so what's curious is that the question has often arisen of what constitutes dry US land, and sometimes sort of absurd ways. So just as one of many examples, just last May, a group of about 20 Cuban nationals arrived at this lighthouse, which is operated by the federal government about 11 kilometers off the coast of Florida. And this lighthouse is built on a reef. There's always water under the lighthouse, but at high tide, there's about 1.5 meters of water. So the Cubans who made it to the lighthouse said, we've reached the United States, this is dry land. And you can actually see them in this photograph taken from a news helicopter. They're up here in this lighthouse, and this is a U.S. Coast Guard vessel trying to convince them to come off. Eventually this was litigated in the court in Miami as they waited on a larger U.S. Coast Guard vessel. And the judge decided that this did not constitute dry land. A number of them passed their credible fear interview and were taken to Guantanamo for processing, and the rest were repatriated to Cuba. Note that none of this has to do with if the U.S. has jurisdiction in this space. Everyone agrees that this is U.S. territory. These are U.S. territorial waters. There's no question about that whatsoever. The question is, does this constitute dry land for the purpose of this particular policy? Okay, so Obama got rid of that, and in his last few days of office, he got rid of the dry foot aspect. And for the first time, just 2 weeks ago, there was an interception of Cubans in the Caribbean, but it's not really clear what procedures were followed on board. So we don't really know what Trump would do. There are some limitations, though. As I said, we see some self-limitation by the executive. There has also been a fair amount over the years of interest group pressure from various parts of civil society, from a network of legal aid providers, from their allies in the US Congress, from media who are concerned with these issues, and they have had some successes kind of around the edges of these kinds of maritime interceptions. International law has not really been any kind of serious constraint, but I would argue that more broadly softer international norms, humanitarian norms rather than rights-based obligations have also limited what the government might also do. Let's turn now to the idea of a buffer between the US and the rest of the world. There has been a lot of buffering going on in secret or quasi-secret, using Mexico as a buffer since the early 1980s. It's becoming less secret over time. It's sensitive in Mexico because the US has a long history of intervening in Mexico. The top half of Mexico was taken by the US in the 19th century. But remarkably, a very high-ranking official in the Department of Homeland Security said in congressional testimony a few years ago that the Guatemalan border with Chiapas being the southernmost state of Mexico, that the Guatemalan border with Chiapas is now the southern border of the US. And there have been similar statements to that effect. So what does that mean for Mexico to be a buffer state? If you actually travel to this area, it's a jungle area with a river here, very thinly populated, very little development. It certainly doesn't look like a buffer state. You don't see guard towers and watchdogs. This doesn't conjure up images of the Berlin Wall. In fact, you can see people who are openly being carried across the river without papers from the bridge, from the formal checkpoint. So people are constantly traveling back and forth without any formal control, and the government evidently doesn't do anything about it. But what you do have in Mexico is what's called, in translation, a vertical frontier, where rather than concentrating forces right along the border, which is what we would typically see in a place like Europe or the US, you see enforcement all along transportation routes, train routes, highway routes, airports, heading north to the US, where there's racial profiling and people who look like they're not Mexican are pulled off and questioned and often detained. The scale of buffering that goes on within Mexico is vast and also little understood. It's been going on in a serious way in terms of deportations since around 1989, 1990, more than 3 million deportations in that time period. The vast majority of the deportations here, these are deportation events rather than people, the vast majority of the deportations are of Central Americans, and specifically 3 nationalities from the so-called Northern Triangle, that is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. If you examine the deportations by the US, compare them to the deportations by Mexico, that's the Mexican deportations in red and by the U.S. in blue. You can see the amount of buffering that goes on and the very strong role played by the Mexican government in this. It's only been really in the last several years that the U.S. has caught up to Mexico. In 2014, 2015, there was a so-called surge of unaccompanied minors and others from Central America arriving at the U.S. border, and the U.S. began applying a lot of pressure on the Mexican government to prevent people from being able to transit Mexican territory. And that pressure was applied effectively. You can see here in 2015 that there are about twice as many deportations of those three nationalities by the Mexican government compared to the U.S. government. Almost all of the Northern Triangle nationalities who are detained in Mexico are deported. You can see the deportations here in red. Almost all of them are, as I said, those who are detained are overwhelmingly deported. In Mexican law, they don't use nasty terms like deportation or detention center. They use euphemisms like many other countries. They refer to places of lodging and returns, but in practice, that's what we're talking about. These policies are not new. In the Q&A, if anyone's interested, I can walk you back to how these have evolved since the early 1980s. Okay, well, remember the Cuban nationals, and when Wet Foot, Dry Foot was conceived and those different pieces of the puzzle came together, most people were thinking that Dry Foot constituted arriving on the beach in South Florida, and that's typically what happened. And often the government made huge efforts to keep people from getting even 100 meters from being in the ocean onto the beach. But you can also get to dry U.S. land via Mexico. And in fact, the distance between Cuba and South Florida is about the same distance as it is across the Yucatan Strait. So beginning in the 2000s, people started hiring fishermen's boats and other forms of people smuggling to arrive in Mexico and then travel north and present their cases at the U.S.-Mexico border. And those cases became more and more common, reaching more than 30,000 cases in 2015. What's interesting here is that this was not an issue of public comment in the U.S. Unless you were a professional researcher on Cuban migration to the U.S., you probably didn't even know this. I mean, even someone who keeps up with the news and reads the New York Times, the Economist, and so forth, probably wouldn't even know this, because people came in a trickle, they were quickly paroled, they then went to Florida, reunited with family members. There was no spectacle of warehouses full of women and children as there was with similar numbers, slightly larger, but the same magnitude of Central Americans arriving at the same time. So it's kind of an interesting illustration of the fact that there is a lot of capacity in the U.S. to very quickly process tens of thousands of people arriving without papers. It's a matter of political will of which nationalities are allowed to kind of go about their business as usual and which are excluded. You can see here that the Mexican government has not done very much buffering. They've had little reason to do much buffering, so they've detained a fairly large number of people, but then quickly released them, typically with a sort of an exit permit that gives the bearer 30 days to leave Mexico. And the idea is that in 30 days you'll have time to get on the bus and go up to the Texas border. So that's what's happened until now. But this avenue no longer exists. So we see increasing numbers of Cubans bottled up inside Mexico. If they present themselves at the U.S. border, since the policy changed in the waning days of the Obama administration, they would be processed like anyone else. And so, interestingly enough, some of them are hoping that because Trump, during the campaign, suggested that there would be a much more hostile relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, that this could work to their advantage. That is their hope, but we don't know if that's going to happen or not. There are much smaller numbers of people coming from Asia and Africa, and here large numbers of them are seeking asylum. The vast majority of them, and let's just talk about Asians for a moment, the vast majority of them are detained in Mexico, especially as they come across the border from Guatemala. They're highly visible. They're detained, but in few cases are they deported. That's even more extreme if you look at treatment of various African nationalities. You can see that detentions are up, but almost none of them are deported. So if the US is pressuring Mexico in these ways, and it is, and since 2007 it's invested many tens of millions of dollars in capacity building, training, giving equipment to the Mexican government to crack down on transit migration. You might ask, why is it that when it comes to Africans and Asians, you see that almost all of them are being released and making their way north? The reason is, number one, the numbers are small. So the US gets about 1 million legal immigrants a year. There are 42 million immigrants in the United States. So if another 2,000 people come through Mexico in itself, that doesn't really mean anything. But sort of, well, it is secret, but now not so secret anymore. Less secret once I published this book. We know that the US government is systematically screening so-called extracontinentals, people from Asia and Africa, while they're in detention centers in Mexico. So the Department of Homeland Security actually has agents on the ground along the border, as well as in various airports in Mexico. And so people have satisfied US security concerns, and if a handful of them apply for asylum in the US, the government doesn't particularly care, at least it hasn't until now. There are some limitations on this kind of buffering activity. One of them is that US funding for the Mexican government to sort of bolster its capacity often comes tied with provisions that the Mexican government apply with human rights norms. And there are particular congressional representatives and senators that take this on as an issue. And so there are a number of many nasty things that go on out in the jungle, but because the continuation of that aid is tied to some kind of observance of those norms, I think that also limits the scope for maneuver of the Mexican government. Historically, there hasn't been very much of a civil society watchdog presence in Mexico, but that is changing pretty quickly. There are a lot of grassroots organizations that are popping up. There are also a lot of organizations that are receiving funding from, interestingly enough, US-based philanthropic foundations. So the Rockefeller Foundation, Open Society, MacArthur, Ford are all funding Mexican civil society projects to keep an eye on human rights abuses, particularly of women, children, and asylum seekers en route through Mexico. And then something that applies very much to the context of Mexican buffering in a way that doesn't, say, to Indonesian buffering with Australia, is that there is so much migration from Mexico to the US that becomes a major issue that's linked to buffering. With the exception of the last couple of years, Mexico has been by far the primary source of especially irregular migration to the US. There are more Mexicans living in the US than there are total immigrants of all nationalities in any other country in the world. So a lot of what the Mexican government does vis-a-vis transit migrants is to create more generous, liberalizing laws that are explicitly based on human rights principles. There's some of the most beautiful laws in the world when it comes to this. And the explicit audience for those is the United States. And when those laws are created, when they're signed, the argument is made that the US government should not treat Mexicans so harshly in the US when Mexico has so improved its treatment of Central Americans and others passing through Mexico. On the other hand, when the US takes all the various unilateral measures, and this will become even more striking if Trump does what he threatens to do, then that becomes very difficult for the Mexican government to be seen as doing the dirty work of the gringos by cracking down on people in transit. So this is another way that, at least in this context, it creates a limitation that doesn't apply to all buffering states everywhere. Another technique is various forms of caging people either in their country of origin or in their region of settlement. Their region of origin or their country of origin. And most famously in the US case, this is not the only place that the US has done this, but most famously is the US naval station in Guantanamo Bay. This is a piece of territory that the US more or less forcibly leased from the Cubans in 1903, having just occupied them. And these days there's a very small processing center that has maybe 30 people or so. setting aside the issue of the so-called war on terror. But the capacity is there to ramp this up very quickly in case of a mass flow out of the Caribbean. There are some limitations on this kind of caging activity. It's also taken place in a number of other Caribbean islands, as well as Tinian in the West Pacific. One is that when it becomes impossible for people to have any kind of legal channels out and to cooperate with the government of the country of origin, that leaves a lot of bad press. So, for example, the U.S. has in the past cooperated with the authorities in Cuba, with the authorities in Haiti, during authoritarian regimes, and that looks bad and with the domestic and international press, that kind of open collaboration of bottling people up and making it impossible for them to get out. The Cuban government in particular has often been quite skillful at linking the U.S. interest in limiting the number of Cubans coming to the U.S. to broader issues in the highly conflictive bilateral relationship, and very explicitly using the idea of a tap to open and close flows of Cubans out as a bargaining chip with the United States. The Cuban government is keenly aware that this creates big domestic problems in the U.S., particularly in a strategic swing state like Florida, when large numbers of Cubans arrive at once. So it's become part of that Cold War conflict. And then, for reasons perhaps of a bit of humanitarianism, but I think more in terms of public relations or the international branding of the U.S. as a leading light humanitarian place and so forth, there has been an effort to periodically create in-country processing programs. Some of these have been at the level of almost pure tokenism. Let's say tokenism. So that applies to, for example, the U.S. In-country processing in Haiti in 1994. There are programs that are much more serious, such as the ongoing program in Cuba. But these programs are tricky because people have to line up outside the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Special Interest section in full view of the security forces, saying that they're being persecuted by those same security forces. So it's a small limitation, but it has, at least in the Cuban case, yielded many thousands of people over the course of a decade who have entered the U.S. under these provisions. Okay, so in closing, let me just move here to the relationship between some of the caging activities in the U.S. and the caging activities on Australia's behalf and Madison and Nauru. As we know, under the first version of a U.S.-Australia deal, the so-called Atlantic solution, there was going to be an exchange where refugees would be exchanged between Guantanamo and Nauru. This never actually happened because the Rudd administration ended the Pacific solution, so this kind of just fell away when the logic for it ended. The second version was what looked everyone like a swap, although the Australian government has insisted that it's not a swap. So under the terms of this, negotiated with the Obama administration just last year in his waning days, and then the details have always been quite murky about this, but that the Australian government would resettle a number of Central Americans who are now in Costa Rica. And not in return, the U.S. would resettle some refugees who would pass the screening process and the two offshore processing centers. These are very different populations. What's interesting about the Central Americans in Costa Rica, they have never been intercepted by the U.S. They have never been to the U.S. This was part of one of these token projects to, on the one hand, try to cut off large numbers of asylum seekers or other irregular migrants trying to reach the U.S. from Central America, but then saying, well, there is a legal avenue for this microscopic number of people who passed an initial screening in country in the 3 northern tribal countries, and then went to Costa Rica for more intensive screening by the UNHCR, paid for by the United States. So in some ways, they're quite different populations. Of course, now we don't know if this is actually going to to happen. There is screening by DHS agents apparently right now, so people are being processed. We don't know what's going to happen because clearly the Trump administration is hostile to this idea, and he has declared it to be a dumb deal that was negotiated to bring thousands of illegal immigrants from Australia to the US, is the way that he has phrased it. So one of the reasons why we don't know what's going to happen with this is not simply the will of the Trump administration, but what's going to happen in the courts with the lawsuits around the second executive order. So the second executive order, I recall that the first one was withdrawn after a number of lawsuits, but the second one does two things which are relevant here. One is that it suspends the refugee resettlement program altogether for 120 days, and secondly, it bans the admission of 6 nationalities for 90 days. Well, these 6 nationalities include people from Iran and Somalia and Sudan, and some of the nationalities of people who are being held in the Australian offshore processing centers. This second executive order also reduces the annual cap for refugees, and so it's quite possible that the cap will be filled before they could be resettled. Although there is a provision for the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of State to jointly decide at their discretion that they will bring in a particular individual. So even beyond the caps, theoretically, if they wanted to, they could bring in the people from the Australian centers. We know that the federal judge in a court in Hawaii blocked this executive order. What's important about his injunction, which is different from the other lawsuits, is that it also includes an injunction on the refugee ban. The one in Maryland only affected this travel ban for 6 nationalities. So right now this is being appealed by the Trump administration, and on May 15th, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, based in San Francisco, which is typically considered to be a liberal court, will be hearing the government's appeal, and hopefully then we'll get a bit more clarity on whether or not these solutions to the caging on the part of both US and Australia will actually come to pass. So with that, I will happily take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, David, very, very much for that. As David mentioned, we do have time for questions, and just a reminder that we are recording, so please signal if you don't want your question recorded. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Yes, so we've got a microphone coming to you.
Thanks very much. I just wondered if you could comment a bit on the nature of the deportations, how they're carried out, what sort of human rights violations are happening, and whether you've seen any improvements since the US has been more involved, or if you could just comment a little bit on the deportations themselves. Thanks.
I might just see if there are any other questions. If there are now, we'll take a cluster of them. No? Over to you.
Sure. Right, so I assume you're talking about the deportations from Mexico?
Back to Central America. Yeah.
Right. So there are various problems with those deportations. The first is that even though it's possible to ask for asylum under Mexican law, very few people know that they can ask for asylum. And there have actually been a number of surveys that have been done of people in detention centers, and only a very small minority know that it's even an option. There have been other studies showing that, especially among children who are in transit, some large percentage of them theoretically seem like they could apply, that they would be eligible for some kind of protection visa in Mexico, but again, very few of them have applied. That is starting to change this year, and asylum applications in Mexico have increased pretty substantially. That is only because civil society on the ground has really been publicizing the right to ask for asylum. In terms of other sorts of conditions, the Mexican government has readmission agreements with the governments of all of the different countries in Central America. Since the 1990s, the US has actually been paying for the deportations of third country nationals. When it comes to the nationals from other countries further afield, the so-called extracontinentals, It's very difficult to repatriate them, in part because the diplomatic presence of those governments is so thin on the ground that it's a low priority for those governments. So that's where they typically are simply released. Probably the greatest threat to someone is to be released into an environment in which criminal gangs have a lot of influence, and there's really not a real distinction between particular government agents and the criminal gangs. When the government last had a serious effort to try to root out the more corrupt officials in the border force, they found that more than 90% of them failed the polygraph, and they had to fire basically the entire force. So the conditions are pretty horrific in terms of predations by gangs, especially dangerous for women. A lot of women take a Provera ejection shot, and what's called the anti-Mexico shot, the rough translation from Spanish, before they leave Central America to pass through Mexico, because they are so concerned about the threat of sexual violence.
My question is a bit more about settlement. I know that the refugees who are going through the process on Nauru, and probably Manus Island as well, are being, when they're resettled, they're actually being told that they'll have to pay back the cost of their airfare. It creates a debt with the US government. And there's limited information about how much assistance, if any, they will receive in the US for settlement and education and these kind of purposes. Is that the same for refugees who are taken from other parts, or is that like an extra condition? Do you know?
In general, there are resettlement benefits, and the federal government contracts with a number of private organizations like there's the Catholic Charities, there's a Lutheran one, there's Hayes, there's a Jewish one, excuse me, the International Rescue Committee, to actually conduct the business of resettlement. And they get, I can't give you the exact figures, but they get a substantial amount of resettlement in the first year, and then for another 5 years in practice they get more diffuse kinds of benefits. But I believe that they are still held liable to repay their airfare. And you know, if you came as a subsistence farmer from Burma, that's probably never going to happen as if you came as a merchant from Iraq. That might well happen.
Thank you.
I think that's the same actually in Canada, that refugees owe a debt to the Canadian government for their airfare as well, which is perhaps a little bit more surprising. Other questions or comments? Claire.
Having a microphone. David, you mentioned that a boat was intercepted in the last few weeks, and we don't know exactly how that was handled. They were Cubans, I think you mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is known about that?
Yeah, all I know is that they were Cuban nationals and they were repatriated to Cuba, but it's not clear if there was a shipboard credible fear interview, as there has been in the past for Cubans alone, or if they've followed the principle of the shout test and are really treating Cubans like all other nationalities. At least in the public discourse, the idea is that Cubans will now be treated like everyone else, but this is a level of detail that you can't get out of a presidential tweet, so we don't know, and because it happens at sea, we can't see it.
So I was interested because you said that a number of the policies or the laws are kind of intended for a US audience, so it's for show. So whereas people might know a lot about certain aspects of who's coming to the US, on the other hand, there's very little awareness of the number of people coming in through particular land borders and the like. I just wondered on the flip side whether you can tell us within Mexico what the perception is about how difficult it might be to reach the US, and then, you know, through Central America more generally, particularly with, you know, Trump's policy announcements about walls and the like. What's kind of, how much is of even Trump's policy announcement tweets are for a US audience, and how much are they intended to reach a wider audience, do you think?
Right, so in general, the level of information about US border policy is extremely high in Mexico. I can't tell you what's known right now because I've been doing the fieldwork in the last few weeks, but I suspect that they have a very high level of information. We also know that the number of new arrivals has dropped off, and this is also typical of what happens when there's some kind of exogenous shock and people just put their plans on hold to see what happens after the crisis. So for example, after the 9/11 attacks, the number of new arrivals from Mexico dropped pretty significantly because people wondered what would happen and they just wanted to wait and see. But in our surveys that we did I did this for 6 years, ending a few years ago, we asked people about what they knew about specific kinds of US border policies, and also to rank order the ones that they thought were most of a deterrent. And we found that all of the kinds of punitive legal policies, such as prosecuting people for illegal entry, which until the 2000s was almost never done, those kinds of things, or being arrested by the Border Patrol, were not a deterrent. The deterrents came from people who were worried about their physical safety. They were worried about dying in the desert, or they were worried about being victimized by bandits on the Mexican side of the border. And over time, the fear of violence along the border became the primary concern. So to the extent that you see any kind of deterrent effect of US policy, it's built on this threat to die. The number of deaths has reached about 6,000 since US border enforcement became intensified in the mid-1990s. That's an average of one person a day who dies trying to enter the US from Mexico. So there's a lot of awareness of the risks. The US also has a publicity campaign in Mexico and Central America, and they've had this for a long time, advertising the risks. Unlike the case of Australian campaigns that are conducted in places like Afghanistan, or European campaigns in Africa, the US campaigns are unbranded advertising. They're presented as if they were produced locally, with local music and so forth, but in fact they're all designed and paid for by the Americans.
David, thank you very much for the presentation, very timely. You alluded on a couple of occasions to civil society in the US and increased engagement with that. Now, recognizing that this is somewhat requiring you to gaze into a crystal ball, to what extent do you see the Trump phenomenon building greater interest amongst civil society in what is happening, particularly with respect to asylum seekers, and how effective do you see that as having any impact on the administration, or are they likely to be completely oblivious to something that is as sensible as human rights and legal frameworks?
Yeah, so one of the most striking things about the impact of Trump's election and then his inauguration and the kinds of policies that he's rolled out is the very strong reaction from civil society. It's really remarkable to see, even in places that are normally pretty apolitical, like San Diego, where it's like here, it's a nice weather and people are out doing yoga on the beach and so forth. But the thousands of people that showed up at the airport without any prior organization during the rollout of the first executive order is really stunning. And we've already seen some very effective campaigns around the detention of particular people who were illegally present in the US and were picked up by the Department of Homeland Security sometimes after they checked in. These were cases of people who in the past would never have been prosecuted or deported even. But because they were detained and they had a lot of public attention to them on behalf of their advocates, a number of them have been released in different parts of the US. This is speculative, but I suspect that that first night on January 27th, when we saw the airport cases being litigated, I suspect that those decisions might have been different had there not been thousands of people outside the courthouse chanting. I'm a legal realist in that sense. So I think it has had a galvanizing effect. Who knows how far this is going to matter, but I'm sure it matters, and I think it especially matters when it comes to issues of externalization, because the whole logic of externalization is for things to happen where they're difficult to see. So to the extent that legal community, advocacy organizations, and media are making these things visible, I think that the abuses are likely to not be ended, but to be reduced.
David, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about UNHCR. You mentioned them only very briefly. I wondered whether that reflected their role in the region, or whether they, how you see their role and responsibility.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that often what happens is that the governments of the global north, which include Australia, they bring in the UNHCR, or they support the work of the UNHCR as they do their buffering policies. And the UNHCR, and even more so the IOM, become unwitting parts of that buffering policy. But then those policies sometimes, over the long run, have a blowback, because the presence of the UNHCR on the ground creates an agency that is observing various abuses and then reporting them. And I know that there's often a lot of criticism of the UNHCR for not reporting things more vigorously, but the UNHCR also does a lot of training of other civil society organizations, which are not as reticent to be outspoken about the abuses that they see. And specifically in the US-Mexico case, the US was instrumental in getting the UNHCR into Mexico in the early 1980s to run the refugee camps, mostly Guatemalans and some Salvadorans in southern Mexico. There was a lot of resistance on the part of most parts of the Mexican government. It was basically the US in concert with the Mexican Foreign Ministry that brought in the UNHCR. Once the UNHCR was there, over time, then they started being outspoken about various abuses that happened in those quite remote camps and jungle areas. So I think that despite the criticism that one finds, especially in the academic literature, that this is a very important way that often the policies of countries in the global north to create these buffers create the seeds of dissent over the long run.
In the interest of time, we'll unfortunately need to have to draw to a close now. But David, thank you very, very much for a presentation that couldn't have been more timely, particularly about a part of the world that I think surprisingly we don't hear as much about in Australia as we might think we would or we should, apart from when our own interests are particularly touched, as we have at the moment, of course, with the US-Australia dumb deal. I think the insights that you've shared with us from your research have been really interesting and also useful from a comparative perspective for us here in Australia. And I want to thank you again for coming and talking with us tonight. Please join me in. I'd also like to thank our hosts, Allens, who are very generous in providing us with this wonderful space, and to Laura in particular for all her work in making this event happen. Thank you so much. To my colleagues at the Kaldor Centre, who have once again brought in the cameras, our publications, manned the mics and so on. Thank you to you as well. And of course to the audience, thank you for coming along. Without you, this would have been quite a different event. And please, if you're not already on our mailing list, do sign up. The next thing that might be of interest to you is that we have a new policy brief coming out very soon by Violetta Moreno-Lax, who some of you might have heard on a panel a number of weeks ago. And that's another comparative piece that's looking at interdiction policies, Australia compared to Europe. So do watch out for that. I hope you have a very pleasant evening, and we look forward to seeing you at another Kaldor Centre event. Thanks once again.